Hello, sleepy detectives, and welcome back. I know you're here to settle in and relax, so if you enjoy these stories, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I love knowing where our community is. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, let's get comfortable and jump straight into tonight's story. Tonight, we open a new file. We are exploring our cases not from the mind of the killer, but through the eyes of the hunter. We are analyzing the psychological cost of staring into the abyss. Our first case is a 20-year marathon. In 1982, a young detective named Dave Reichert was one of the first at the scene, looking at a body pulled from the Green River. He promised the victim's family he would find the killer. He had no idea that promise would consume the next 2 decades of his life, becoming a cold case obsession that would push him to his mental limits. This isn't just the story of Gary Ridgway. This is the story of the detective who refused to let him go. In the world of homicide investigation, there are cases, and then there are careers. Most detectives, even the good ones, spend their lives solving a series of disconnected tragedies. They are sprints, they are puzzles. But every so often, a detective, usually early in their career, stumbles upon a case that is not a sprint. It is a psychological marathon. It is a 20-year desert. It is an abyss that stares back, defines their life, shapes their mind, and demands a piece of their soul. For Dave Reichert, that case began on July 15, 1982. He was a 32-year-old detective with the King County Sheriff's Office in Washington. He was young, but he was not naive. He had already faced death, having had his throat slit during a domestic violence call years earlier. He was a man of quiet, devout Christian faith, a husband and a father. On that July day, he was called to the Green River near Kent, Washington. 2 boys, rafting, had found her. The victim was Wendy Lee Cofield, just 16 years old. She was found snagged on a log boom, her body pale and waterlogged. She had been strangled. Reichert was one of the first detectives on the scene, and this, right here, is the inciting incident. This is the moment the marathon begins. The scene was chaotic, sad, but just weeks later, on August 12th, another call. 2 more bodies found near the river, then another, then another. This was not a single, tragic murder. This was a cluster. The media, in its simple, brutal way, gave the phantom a name: the Green River Killer. A task force was formed immediately. The pressure was immense. The idyllic green landscape of the Pacific Northwest had suddenly become a dumping ground. The killer was hunting the SeaTac Strip, an area near the Seattle-Tacoma Airport known for runaways and sex workers. And this is where the psychological component of the investigation begins. These were not, in the eyes of the media or the public, high-priority victims. They were the forgotten, the marginalized. But for Dave Reichert, they were children. He was a young father himself. He was the one assigned the horrifying, meticulous, and soul-crushing job of making the death notifications. He was the one who had to sit in living rooms with grieving mothers, fathers, and siblings, and listen to the stories of the lives that had been extinguished. And in those rooms, fueled by a young detective's empathy and his own deep Christian sense of right and wrong, Dave Reichert made a promise. He promised them again and again, "We will find him. I will not give up." This is the psychological burden. This is the seed. He was not just assigned to the case. He was now bound to it. He had made a moral contract, not just with his badge, but with the families of the dead. He had no idea that contract would take 20 years to fulfill. The investigation was immediate, massive, and a total disaster. The 1980s were the dawn of serial killer profiling, But the reality was chaos. The task force was flooded with tips, thousands of them. Psychics called. Inmates offered false confessions. The political pressure from Seattle was unbearable. The killer was still active, still hunting. The detectives were working in a state of controlled panic. And Reichert, watching the body count rise, realized they were not just hunting a man. They were hunting a new kind of predator, a ghost. A man who could kill and blend back into society. They were in over their heads. In 1984, the case was stalled. The body count was climbing past 20. Reichert, now a lead on the task force, was desperate. He felt the weight of those unfulfilled promises. And he made a decision that was, at the time, radical. It was a psychological Hail Mary. He decided that if his team could not think like this new monster, they needed to find someone who could. This is our B-plot. This is the ghost of Ted Bundy. Reichert and his partner, Bob Keppel, flew to Florida State Prison. They walked down death row, and they sat across from the devil himself. Ted Bundy, the charming, brilliant, narcissistic sociopath, was just years from his own execution. Reichert sat there in a small, hot room, looking at the man who represented pure, articulate evil, and he asked him for help. And Bundy, the ultimate narcissist, loved it. He was thrilled to be the expert. He loved the game. Reichert played along. He fed Bundy's ego. He made him feel like the brilliant consultant. And Bundy talked. He gave Reichert and Keppel a psychological autopsy of their Riverman. Bundy, with chilling, casual accuracy, began to build a profile. He told them the killer was not a drifter. He lived or worked in the area. He knew the dumping grounds. He told them the killer was targeting sex workers because they were vulnerable, easy, and possessed in his mind. He told them the killer likely hated them, but also felt compelled by them. And then Bundy leaned in, and he gave them the one terrible detail that only another monster could have known. A detail that would haunt Reichert, but would, 20 years later, prove to be the key. Bundy said, he's a necrophiliac. He explained that the real motive, the core of the compulsion, was not just the killing. It was the possession of the body after death. Bundy told them he will be returning to the bodies. He will be using them. He explained that the killer would be positioning the bodies, staging them, having a relationship with them. Reichert, the devout family man, was listening to a description of an evil so profound it was almost beyond comprehension. He left that prison in Florida a changed man. The abyss had not just looked back, it had spoken. It had given him a lecture. Reichert now understood with terrifying clarity exactly what he was hunting. He was no longer just looking for a man. He was looking for a specific, organized, and sexually sadistic predator. He was hunting a monster. He just didn't know that the monster's name was Gary Ridgway. Armed with the horrifying, almost supernatural insight from Ted Bundy, Dave Reichert and the task force had a new, sharper focus. They weren't just looking for a suspect. They were looking for Bundy's suspect. A man who was organized, sexually motivated, and, critically, local. The investigation tightened. They cross-referenced known sex offenders, Johns, and men with a history of violence against sex workers. And in 1987, 5 years into the marathon, they had him. The name that rose to the top of the list was Gary Leon Ridgway. He was a 38-year-old truck painter at the Kenworth plant. He was married. He was, like Reichert, a devout Bible-reading Christian who attended church regularly. He was, on the surface, a nothing, a gray, forgettable man. But his profile was a perfect, screaming match. He had a history of arrests related to sex work. He had an unnaturally high sex drive. And, most importantly, his work and home addresses placed him at the very epicenter of the murder clusters. He knew the dumping grounds. Reichert and the task force felt it. This was him. This was the Riverman. They brought him in. And this is where the marathon entered its most torturous phase. This is the beginning of the desert. This is the psychological frustration of knowing you have the right man, but being unable to prove it. They put Ridgway in the interrogation room. He was not like Bundy. He was not a charming, articulate narcissist. He was a low-class narcissist. He was simple, he giggled, he was emotionally stunted, and he was cunning. He denied everything. So the task force turned to the best tool they had in 1987, the polygraph, the lie detector. Ridgway, the man who had murdered at least 40 women, sat in the chair hooked up to the machine, and he passed. The machine, the objective, scientific tool, said he was telling the truth. This was a devastating psychological blow to the task force. The test was flawed. Ridgway, perhaps due to his unique, compartmentalized, or simple mind, had beaten it. The investigators were now split. Some believed the machine. Some, like Reichert, believed their gut. They pressed on. They got a warrant. They searched his home. They searched his truck. They found nothing. No trophies, no smoking gun. Ridgway was, as Bundy predicted, organized. He was clean. As a final, last-ditch effort, they took samples. They took hair samples. And they took a saliva sample, a simple vial of his DNA, and they filed it away. And then they had to let him go. They had to stand there in 1987 and watch their prime suspect, the man they knew was the Green River Killer, walk out of the police station, get in his truck, and drive home. This is the desert. For 14 years, the case went cold. The political pressure, which had been a fire, turned to ash. The media moved on. The public, though scarred, began to forget. The Green River Task Force, once a massive operation, was cut. It was dissolved. The filing cabinets were wheeled into storage. The case became a bureaucratic footnote. But for Dave Reichert, it never went cold. This is the psychological cost. This is the marathon. For 14 years, Reichert, who was promoted, who had other cases, who had a life, was still, in his mind, walking the banks of that river. He was haunted by the promises he had made to those families in 1982. Every time he saw a headline about the failed investigation, it was a personal failure. And he was haunted by a far more terrifying thought. Ridgway was still out there. Reichert had to live every single day with the psychological torture of knowing that the man he had let go, the man who had beaten him, was free. Was he still killing? Was he watching Reichert from afar? The desert is the part of the detective story that is never shown in the movies. It is not the thrill of the chase. It is the agonizing, slow, dull pain of waiting. It is the obsession. It is the file boxes he kept near his desk, the ones everyone else had forgotten. It was the faces of Wendy Cofield, of the other victims, that he saw when he tried to sleep. It was 14 years of knowing the monster was free, and that he, Dave Reichert, had been the one to let him go. This is the crucible that forged the detective who would, in 2001, finally get a second chance. The marathon was not over. He was just waiting, in the desert, for the one piece of science that could finally bring him home. 14 years, a generation. Dave Reichert was no longer a young detective. He was now the sheriff of King County. He was in charge of the entire department. But the Green River file, dusty and cold, still sat in the corner of his mind, a monument to his greatest failure. The marathon was, for all intents and purposes, over. And then, in 2001, science finally caught up. The Washington State Crime Lab, armed with a new, powerful form of DNA testing called STR, decided, as a matter of protocol, to retest old, high-priority cold cases. They pulled the evidence from the Green River file. They found the semen samples, preserved for 2 decades, from victims Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen, and Cynthia Hines. And then, they pulled the old saliva sample, taken in 1987, from the man who had beaten the polygraph, the man who had walked away, Gary Leon Ridgway. The lab ran the test, and there it was. Not a theory, not a profile, not a hunch. A 100% irrefutable scientific match. On November 30th, 2001, Dave Reichert, now sheriff, sat in a briefing room and listened to the words he had waited 19 years, 4 months, and 15 days to hear. They had him. The marathon was not over. It was just the final lap. The arrest was quiet. It was anticlimactic. A team of detectives, including some of the original 1982 task force members, drove to the Kenworth truck plant where Ridgway still worked. They found him in the break room, listening to a religious radio station. They called his name. He looked up. They cuffed him. Dave Reichert, the man who had been haunted by this ghost for 2 decades, watched as they brought him in. The monster was finally real. He was not a phantom. He was a small, unassuming, 52-year-old man who looked, as one detective put it, like a damn librarian. The forensic chase was over. The media celebrated. The city was relieved. But for Sheriff Reichert, the real work, the psychological battle, was just beginning. They had him on 4 murders. Reichert's promise, the burden he had carried since 1982, was not to the 4 victims with DNA. It was to all of them. The 40, 50, or maybe 60 women whose families were still waiting. Ridgway, in the interrogation room, was smug. He was quiet. He knew the game. He would admit to what the DNA proved, and nothing more. The forensic turning point was complete, but it was hollow. It had caught a killer, but it had not delivered justice. To fulfill the promise, Reichert had to do what science could not. He had to break open Gary Ridgway's mind and get him to confess to everything. The final 6-month psychological marathon was about to begin. The forensic marathon was over. The psychological marathon had just begun. Sheriff Dave Reichert had his man in a cell, but the victory was hollow. The DNA proved 4 murders. Reichert's promise, the one that had haunted him for 20 years, was to the families of all the victims, the forgotten, the unnamed. The lead prosecutor, Jeff Baird, understood this. He also understood the political and moral nightmare, a 20-year trial for 4 murders, while 40 or more other families would get no answers. So, they offered the deal. It was a simple, agonizing bargain. Gary Ridgway, the most prolific serial killer in American history, would be spared the death penalty. In exchange, he had to do one thing: confess. To everything, to everyone. He had to lead them, body by body, to every dumping ground, to every skeleton, to every forgotten memory. He had to give the families their answers. The task force detectives, hardened men who had lived this case, began the interrogation. And they hit a wall. This is the low-class narcissist at work. Gary Ridgway was not a brilliant, articulate monster like Ted Bundy. He was a simple, cunning, emotionally stunted creature. And now, he was the center of attention. He loved it. He would sit there, giggling. He would play games. He would admit only to what the DNA proved, then stonewall. He would toy with them. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. He was in control. And for 20 years, he had been in control. The detectives were at a breaking point. The deal would collapse. The 40 families would get no justice. This is when Sheriff Dave Reichert, the man who had started the marathon, stepped in to finish it. He sat and he thought. He didn't look at the evidence files. He looked at the man. He thought back 20 years. He had harvested the seeds. Seed 1, his own faith. Reichert was a devout Lutheran, a man who believed in a moral universe, in right and wrong, in sin and redemption. Seed 2, Ridgway's faith. He remembered from the 1987 file and the 2001 arrest. Ridgway was also a devout, born-again Christian. He was known to read the Bible in the truck plant break room. He was obsessed with sin, particularly the sin of the sex workers he simultaneously craved and hated. Reichert understood. This was the psychological key. Other detectives were attacking Ridgway's pride, trying to outsmart him, trying to force a confession. They were failing. Reichert decided to attack Ridgway's fear. He realized that Gary Ridgway, the man who had committed necrophilia and murdered 49 women, was, in his own warped, compartmentalized mind, terrified of going to hell. The final psychological turning point was set. Reichert walked into the interrogation room, alone. He was not wearing his sheriff's uniform, he was not carrying a gun, he was not carrying an evidence file. In his hand, he was carrying a small, simple religious tract, a pamphlet from his own Lutheran church, titled The Law and the Gospel. He sat down. Ridgway, expecting another cop, looked at him, confused. Reichert, in his calm, quiet, detective pastor voice, began. He did not say, "We have you, Gary." He did not say, "Tell us what you did." He said, "Gary, I'm not here today as the sheriff. I'm here as a fellow Christian, and I've been reading this tract. I want to talk to you about it." He opened the pamphlet. He explained the law, the 10 Commandments, the moral code of God. This, he said, is what condemns you. This is the proof of your sin. And then he turned the page. But then, Reichert said, there is the gospel. The gospel is the good news, Gary. It is the news of forgiveness. It is the news of redemption. Ridgway, the monster, was listening intently. Reichert leaned in. But Gary, to get that forgiveness, you have to truly be sorry. You have to confess. You have to clear your soul. He looked at Ridgway. My faith tells me that I don't want to see anyone, not even you, Gary, go to hell. And with those words, the psychological wall, the 40-year-old compartmentalization that had allowed Ridgway to read the Bible in the morning and kill a woman at night, shattered. Gary Leon Ridgway, the Green River Killer, the man who had giggled at detectives, put his head in his hands and began to sob. He was not crying for his victims. He was crying for himself. Reichert had bypassed the killer and spoken directly to the terrified, sinful child inside. Ridgway looked up, his face red, tears streaming. I know, he whispered. I know. I need to do this. I've needed to do this for a long time. The marathon was over. The dam had broken. What followed was 6 months, 180 days of the most extensive, horrifying confession in criminal history. Reichert and his detectives sat for hundreds of hours, the tapes rolling, as Ridgway, now cooperative, opened the boxes in his mind, one by one. He took them on field trips. He would sit in the back of a van, calm, eating a sandwich, and say, "Stop here." He would walk into the woods, the detectives following, and point to a pile of leaves. She's right there. And they would dig, and they would find a skeleton. He confessed to 48 murders. Later, 49. And as he confessed, the B-plot was harvested. He confirmed, in graphic, chilling detail, everything Ted Bundy had predicted. He confessed to the necrophilia. He confessed to returning to the bodies again and again. He confessed to the relationships he had with them. He confessed to his pride in his work. Dave Reichert had did it. He had stared into the abyss. He had talked to the devil, Bundy, to get the map. And he had used his own faith, the gospel, to disarm the monster, Ridgway. He had kept his promise. The 6-month psychological marathon of confessions was complete. The final tally was staggering. Gary Ridgway admitted to 48 murders and was suspected of dozens more. He had confessed in such detail, with such cold, dispassionate recall, that the detectives were left shattered. He had fulfilled his end of the deal. In 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced. He was spared the death penalty, but he received 48 consecutive life sentences, one for each life he had admitted to taking. He will die in prison. The deal was, and remains, controversial. Many, including some detectives, wanted to see him executed. But for Dave Reichert, justice was a more complex word. The death penalty would have been justice for one murder. The deal, as agonizing as it was, had brought truth to 48 families. The 40-plus families who had lived in the desert with Reichert for 20 years. They finally had an answer. They had a name. They had a place to mourn. The promises Dave Reichert had made as a young detective in 1982 were finally, agonizingly fulfilled. This is the psychological cost of the marathon. This is the truth of the detective's journey. To win, Reichert had to do more than just hunt. He had to understand. He had to sit in a room with Ted Bundy and absorb the mind of a monster just to get a map. And then, 20 years later, he had to sit in a room with another monster, Gary Ridgway. But this time, he couldn't just understand him. He had to connect with him. He had to find the one shared piece of humanity, a warped, terrified, but shared faith, and use it as a key. He had stared into the abyss, not just for a moment, but for 2 decades. He had listened to 6 months of confessions so depraved they tested the limits of his own faith. He survived the marathon not because he was smarter than the killer or faster, but because his obsession for justice was, in the end, greater than Ridgway's compulsion to kill. The young detective who had stood by the river in 1982 was gone. In his place was Sheriff Reichert, a man who had walked through the desert and had come out the other side, carrying the weight of 48 souls. He had kept his promise. This is the second case from our Detective's POV file. It is a 3,000-mile psychological chase where the only map was a series of lies. The children are in London, H.H. Holmes wrote from his cell. They are in Cincinnati. They are in Detroit. While the world was obsessed with his murder castle, America's first serial killer was playing a final, sadistic game with Detective Frank Geyer, the man who had caught him. This isn't a story about secret rooms and trapdoors. It's the story of a detective's marathon. It's about a relentless, methodical father, digging through cellars in the summer heat, learning to decode the mind of a pathological liar, one horrifying discovery at a time. In the files of criminal psychology, there are killers who are defined by their compulsion. Men like Ridgway, driven by a base, repetitive urge. And then, there are killers who are defined by their performance. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, was a performer. He was America's first great celebrity serial killer. He was a con artist, a bigamist, a pathological liar, and a psychological architect. He was a man who understood that if you told a lie big enough and told it with a smile, people would want to believe you. His entire life was a grift. His most famous performance, of course, was the building that the Yellow Press would later dub the Murder Castle. It was a 3-story hotel built for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, a labyrinth of his own design. It was a physical manifestation of his warped mind, a maze of windowless rooms, secret passages, trap doors, and a basement kiln. But the castle was, itself, a con. He hadn't just built it to kill, he had built it to defraud. He scammed his lenders, his suppliers, his investors. And it was this obsession with fraud, not murder, that would ultimately be his undoing. In 1894, with his creditors closing in, Holmes needed one last big score. He turned to his longtime associate, a carpenter and alcoholic named Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was a classic accomplice, weak-willed, trusting, and in awe of Holmes's genius. Holmes, the genius, crafted a perfect plan. Pitezel would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy on himself. Then, Pitezel would fake his own death in a fiery laboratory explosion. Holmes, the doctor, would find a suitable cadaver, disfigure it, and plant it at the scene. He would identify the body as Pitezel, collect the $10,000, and they would split the profits. It was a brilliant, simple con. But H.H. Holmes was a malignant narcissist, and a narcissist does not share. In September 1894 in Philadelphia, the plan was set. But Holmes had no intention of finding a replacement cadaver. It was too much work. It was too messy. It was easier to just use Pitezel. He murdered his accomplice. He rendered Pitezel unconscious with chloroform, and then, just to be sure, he finished the job with benzene, setting the man's body ablaze. To the coroner, it looked like a tragic accident. Dr. Holmes, the grieving friend, identified the charred remains. The insurance company paid out. The con was a success. Holmes had his money. But he had made a mistake. He had performed his con in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia had Detective Frank Geyer. Now we must introduce our protagonist. Frank Geyer was the opposite of H.H. Holmes. He was not a monster hunter. He was not a brilliant profiler. He was a 38-year-old detective for the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company, also working with the Philadelphia police. His psychological profile was one of patience. He was methodical. He was a man of ledgers, paperwork, and details. He was, most importantly, a father. He was assigned to the Patel case not as a murder, but as a fraud. The insurance company smelled a rat, and Geyer, the patient investigator, began to follow the paper trail. He didn't look for trapdoors, he looked for bank records. He meticulously, slowly, tracked the movements of H.H. Howard, Holmes's preferred alias. He followed the money, he followed the lies, and in November 1894, Geyer's methodical, boring police work paid off. He tracked Holmes to Boston and arrested him. The case, for all intents and purposes, should have been over. Detective Geyer, the insurance investigator, had caught the con man. But this is where the real story begins. This is where the case shifts from a simple fraud to a psychological marathon. While Holmes sat in a Philadelphia jail cell, a terrified woman named Carrie Pitezel, Benjamin's wife, came to Detective Geyer, and she told him an impossible story. She explained that Dr. Holmes, their trusted family friend, had told her that Benjamin was not dead. He was, Holmes claimed, in hiding in London, waiting for the insurance heat to die down. Carrie, desperate and trusting, had believed him. And then she said the words that changed everything. Holmes had convinced her that it was too dangerous for her to travel with her 3 children. So, as a kindness, Holmes had taken them. He had taken Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, and Howard, 8. He had promised to take them to London to reunite them with their hiding father. But Carrie hadn't heard from her children in weeks. Geyer, the father, felt a cold psychological dread that had nothing to do with insurance fraud. He went to the jail cell. He confronted H.H. Holmes. And this is where our B-plot, The Letters from the Cell begins. Holmes did not look like a trapped animal. He was not scared. He was amused. He was a performer, and Geyer was his new, captive audience. Geyer, the methodical detective, asked the simple question, "Where are the Pitzel children?" Holmes smiled, and he told his first grand, sadistic lie. "Why, detective?" he said. "They are perfectly fine. I had an associate, a widow by the name of Minnie Williams, take them to London, England. They are quite safe." Geyer, the man who had just spent months untangling this man's financial lies, looked at the smiling, confident face of H. Holmes, and he knew. He knew he was looking at a pathological liar. He knew the children were not in London, and he knew his marathon was just beginning. The marathon began. It was June of 1895. Detective Frank Geyer, a methodical, patient man, stepped out of the Philadelphia station, leaving H. Holmes in his cell. Holmes, the performer, was comfortable. He was safe. He was, for the first time in years, able to rest, knowing his new audience, Geyer, was about to begin the performance. Geyer was not comfortable. He was walking into a psychological funhouse designed by a genius, and it was hot. A brutal, suffocating heat wave had settled over the Midwest. As Geyer traveled, his heavy wool suit sticking to his skin, the heat became a constant, oppressive character in his hunt. It was a physical manifestation of the psychological hell he was entering. He was working alone. He carried with him the B-plot, the Letters from the Cell. Holmes, from his jail, had become a prolific correspondent. He sent Geyer letters. He sent Carrie Pitzel letters. He sent his wives letters. All of them were full of lies, contradictions, and false hope. "The children are well," he wrote. "They're in Cincinnati. Or perhaps I sent them to. Yes, I believe it was Detroit." Geyer, the methodical father, read these lies and made his first critical psychological decision. He would ignore the words. He would follow the trail. He would not be guided by Holmes's voice. He would be guided by Holmes's actions. He began in Cincinnati, Ohio. Geyer was not a profiler, but he was a patient investigator. He did not look for clues. He looked for records. He went from hotel to hotel in the blistering heat, showing a photograph of Holmes under the alias H. Howard and 3 small children. He found nothing. No one remembered a man with 3 children. The B-plot, the lie from the cell, was already proving false. A lesser detective would have stalled, would have written back to Holmes, "You lied." Geyer was not a lesser detective. He kept digging, expanding his search. If Holmes wasn't with the children, perhaps he had boarded them. Geyer went to boarding houses. He went to orphanages. Still nothing. Finally, at a small hotel, a clerk recognized the photo. "Yes," he said. "Mr. Howard, he was here." Geyer felt the first small spark of adrenaline. "Was he with the children?" "No," the clerk said. "He was alone. He was here for furniture." "Gee, furniture." The clerk explained. Mr. Howard had checked in with a very large, heavy trunk. He had seemed distressed about its condition. He had asked for a local furniture repairman. Geyer, the insurance investigator, the man of ledgers, felt a cold, psychological dread. This was a detail that mattered. He found the repairman. The man's name was A.B. Caffey. Geyer interviewed him. Caffey remembered the job perfectly. "Strange fellow, that Howard," Caffey said. "He hired me to reinforce a large trunk. He wanted new locks. He wanted a stronger bottom." Caffey explained he had also been asked to drill a small hole about a half-inch wide near the top lock. "What for?" Geyer asked. He said it was for a hose pipe, Caffey recalled. He said he needed to ship delicate scientific instruments. said he was an inventor. He needed to pipe gas into the trunk to protect the contents. This is the psychological turning point. Geyer, standing in that hot Cincinnati workshop, understood. He was not looking for 3 children. He was following a trunk. Holmes's M.O., his modus operandi, was revealed. He was not traveling with the children. He was shipping them. The lies from the cell were a distraction. The trunk was the truth. Geyer now had a new trail. He followed the shipping manifests, the railway records. He followed the trunk. The trail led him to Indianapolis, Indiana. He arrived. He went to the rental agencies. He found that H. Howard had rented a small, furnished cottage in the suburb of Irvington. Geyer went to the cottage. He interviewed the neighbors. And the story shifted again. Yes, the neighbors said, we remember Mr. Howard. He was here, but he wasn't alone. Geyer's heart must have seized. He was with a boy, the neighbors said. A small, quiet boy, Howard Pitzel. Geyer processed this. Holmes had split them up. The girls, Alice and Nellie, were somewhere else. He had isolated the 8-year-old boy. The neighbors said the boy had seemed sad. Mr. Howard had told them he was a bad boy who needed discipline. And then the final detail. The neighbors said Mr. Howard had gone to the local hardware store. He had purchased a shovel. And then he had left, alone, just days later, without the boy. This is the psychological cost. Geyer, the father, now knew. He was no longer a detective. He was an undertaker. He went into the small rented cottage. It was empty. It was suffocatingly hot. He searched the rooms, and then he went to the cellar. It was a small, dirt-floored room, and in the corner, Geyer saw it. It was not a grave. It was a shape. The dark, packed earth was disturbed. It was a rectangle, the exact size of the reinforced trunk from Cincinnati. Holmes hadn't even bothered to hide the shape. It was an act of pure, arrogant, narcissistic laziness. Geyer, the detective, stood alone in that cellar, and he began to dig. We must understand what this cost him. This was not a modern exhumation. There was no team. There was Frank Geyer, a father, in a hot, dark, silent room with a shovel. He dug into the packed earth, and he found him. What was left of Howard Pitzel, 8 years old. Holmes had buried the boy in a shallow grave, and then, to speed the decomposition, had covered him with quicklime. All Geyer found were fragments, a few small bones, a jawbone, a handful of milk teeth. The marathon was real. Geyer had found the first ghost. He had won the first round of Holmes's game. But the psychological cost was immense. He had learned to think like Holmes. He had learned to follow the M.O. And he now knew with absolute certainty that he was no longer looking for 2 living girls. He was looking for another rented house and another grave. The discovery in the Indianapolis cellar changed the nature of the marathon. It was no longer a rescue mission. Frank Geyer knew that. It was now a grim, methodical recovery. He was no longer just an investigator. He was, as he had been in that hot, dark cellar, an undertaker. The psychological cost was immense. He was a father who had just pieced together the remains of another man's son. He was exhausted by the heat, exhausted by the travel, and exhausted by the sheer, calculated evil of his opponent. But the discovery of Howard's body and the M.O. of the trunk had also armed him. He now understood the mind of H. Holmes. He knew Holmes was lazy, arrogant, and repetitive. While Geyer was sending a telegram back to Philadelphia with the horrifying news, our B-plot, the letters from the cell, was already adapting. H. Holmes, back in his cell, received the news that Geyer had found Howard. He was not horrified, he was not ashamed, he was annoyed. Geyer had outsmarted him. Geyer had won the Indianapolis round. So, Holmes, the pathological narcissist, immediately changed the narrative. He sent a new flurry of letters. Geyer is mistaken, he wrote to his lawyers. He has found the bones of some other poor child. The Pitzel children are fine. I merely separated them. He gave Geyer a new false trail. The girls, Alice and Nellie, Holmes claimed, are in Detroit. They are safe. I left them with a trusted associate. It was another lie, another move in the psychological chess game. But Frank Geyer was no longer playing Holmes's game. He was playing his own. He ignored the lie about the trusted associate. He knew the M.O. He got on the next train, not to find the associate, but to find the rental house. He arrived in Detroit, Michigan. The heat was still oppressive. The hunt began again. He went to the rental agencies. He went to the hotels. He showed the photos. Holmes, Howard, and this time just the two girls, Alice and Nellie. He found them. A hotel clerk remembered them. Mr. Howard had checked in with the two girls. They had stayed for several days. Geyer then went, methodically, to the transfer companies, the hardware stores, and he found the pattern repeated. He confirmed that H. Holmes, while in Detroit, had rented another house, this time on John R. Street, purchased another shovel, and purchased another large, brand-new trunk. Geyer, his heart sinking, went to the rented house on John R. Street. He knew what he was looking for. He interviewed the neighbors. They remembered the strange man and the two quiet, sad-looking girls. They remembered him leaving, alone, with a large, heavy trunk. Geyer searched the house. He went to the cellar. He found nothing. The earth was undisturbed. The house was empty. This was a new, agonizing, psychological blow. Geyer's mind raced. He had understood the M.O. too well. Holmes, having been caught in Indianapolis, had learned. He had adapted. He had realized that burying a body at the rental house was a mistake. It left a trail. This time, he had killed them in the house. He had packed them into the new trunk, and he had shipped them somewhere else. Geyer, the methodical detective, was one step behind. He had found the scene of the murder, but the bodies were gone. He was now, literally, chasing a coffin. He was exhausted, but he was relentless. He went back to the only trail that mattered, the paperwork. He went to the railway shipping offices. He spent days in the humid summer heat poring over ledgers, looking for a Mr. Howard shipping a large, heavy trunk. He found it. A trunk matching the description had been shipped from Detroit to Toronto, Canada. The marathon had crossed an international border. Geyer got on another train. He arrived in Toronto. He felt the chase was nearing its end. The pattern was clear. Holmes was running out of moves. He found the customs house records. The trunk had arrived. He found the rental agency. Mr. Howard had rented another small cottage, this time at 16 St. Vincent Street. Geyer went to the house. He interviewed the neighbors. This was the final, horrifying echo. The neighbors remembered the man. They remembered him arriving with the trunk. And they remembered the smell. A terrible, sweet, sickening smell that had permeated the neighborhood for days until the man had, just as suddenly, disappeared. Geyer knew. He walked to the small rented house. He didn't need to search the rooms. He went straight to the cellar. It was a small, damp space. In the corner, he saw it. A patch of loose earth, crudely turned over. He began to dig. He did not have to dig far. Just inches beneath the dirt, he struck wood. It was the trunk. Geyer, with what must have been a soul-destroying weariness, pried the lid open. The marathon was over. Inside, he found them. The bodies of Alice, 15, and Nellie, 11, were packed together, decomposing, their arms still around each other. But Holmes, in his infinite narcissistic cruelty, had added one final theatrical touch. In the top of the trunk, Geyer found a small hole, about a half-inch wide, that had been drilled through the wood, and he found the faint, lingering smell of coal gas. Geyer, the detective, pieced together the final, horrific minutes. Holmes had likely lured the girls into the trunk, perhaps as a game. He had then sealed it, run a gas hose from a nearby pipe into the hole, and had stood there, listening, as the two children suffocated. He had, once again, performed his magic trick. He had made the children disappear. The marathon was over. Frank Geyer, the methodical detective from Philadelphia, had completed his 3,000-mile journey through hell. He had followed the lies, he had decoded the M.O., and he had recovered the bodies of Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitzel. He returned not as a hero, but as a profoundly weary man, a father who had seen the absolute depths of narcissistic evil. His testimony, his meticulous, step-by-step account of the summer-long hunt, the trunks, the cellars, the gas hose, would be the evidence that finally, conclusively, sent H.H. Holmes to the gallows. The murder castle in Chicago was a theatrical house of horrors, but it was Geyer's methodical pursuit of the Pitzel children that truly unmasked the man. And this brings us to our final psychological turning point, the why. Why did H.H. Holmes, H.H. Holmes, a man already in jail, play this sadistic game? And why was Frank Geyer the man to win it? First, we must decode the mind of the killer. H.H. Holmes was a malignant narcissist. He was a performer, a con artist. His entire life was a performance, and he was his only audience. When Frank Geyer arrested him, Holmes was, for the first time, trapped. He was in a cell. The performance was over. Or so he thought. The B-plot, the letters from the cell, was his final, desperate performance. He was bored, he was enraged, and in Detective Geyer, he saw one last captive audience. The lies he told, they are in London, they are in Detroit, were not clumsy attempts to hide the truth. They were a game. He was a cat, playing with a mouse from inside his own cage. He was a pathological liar, pseudologia fantastica, a man who lied for the sheer psychological pleasure of it. He wanted to prove one last time that he was smarter than the flat-footed, methodical detective who had caught him. He wanted to make Geyer run, to make him sweat, to make him fail. This entire horrific cross-country chase was, for Holmes, nothing more than entertainment. But he made one fatal psychological miscalculation. He assumed he was playing against a man like himself, a man who would be moved by ego, emotion, and frustration. He was not. He was playing against Frank Geyer. And this is where we decode the mind of the detective. Geyer won this psychological marathon for two simple reasons, the very seeds we planted in Act 1. First, he was not a profiler. He was an insurance investigator. Geyer's mind was not built for dramatic leaps of intuition. It was built for method. It was built for paperwork, for ledgers, for cross-referencing shipping manifests. When Holmes sent him a lie, the B-plot, Geyer did not get angry. He did not get frustrated. He simply ignored it. He treated Holmes's words as noise and focused with relentless, boring, methodical patience on the paper trail, the A-plot. Holmes, the chaotic narcissist, was playing chess. Geyer, the methodical detective, was playing checkers. He just kept moving, one square at a time, following the receipts, the hotel logs, the railway bills. He did not decode Holmes's lies. He bypassed them. He defeated the performer with paperwork. Second, he was a father. This was the psychological engine that Holmes could not comprehend. Holmes, a man who saw children as pawns, like the Pitzel children, or tools, like his own child, whom he abandoned, could not understand the mind of a true father. Geyer was not motivated by ego. He was not trying to win a game. He was driven by a profound, empathetic duty. When he stood in that hot cellar in Indianapolis, digging with his own hands, he was not a cop. He was a father, recovering a son. This combination, the patient mind of an accountant and the relentless heart of a father, made Frank Geyer the perfect psychological counteragent to H.H. Holmes. Holmes, the performer, had finally met the one man in the world who was completely immune to his show. There is an old warning. When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. For most detectives, that is a metaphor. For Sheriff Art Schley, in 1957, the abyss was a 9-bedroom farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. This is not the story of Ed Gein's madness. This is the story of how that madness became a contagion. It is the story of a psychological turning point where a good, simple man was so broken by what he saw that it cost him his mind and ultimately his life. To understand the cost of this case, you must first understand the man it broke. Sheriff Arthur Art Schley. He was not a hard-bitten, big-city homicide detective. He was not a monster hunter. He was the 43-year-old sheriff of Plainfield, Wisconsin, population 648. Plainfield, in 1957, was the American ideal. It was a Norman Rockwell painting. It was a quiet, isolated farming community where everyone knew everyone. Doors were left unlocked. The greatest crimes Art Schley had to deal with were, by and large, bar fights, stolen tractors, or teenagers speeding. Art Schley was a product of this environment. He was a neighbor. He was a decent, simple, and by all accounts, normal man. He was a husband, a father. His psychology was one of order. He was the barrier that kept the small town peace. He was, in short, the last man in the world psychologically prepared for what he was about to find. Every small town has its eccentrics, and Plainfield's was Edward Theodore Gain, Old Ed. He was not seen as a threat. He was seen as harmless. He was a 51-year-old recluse, a quiet, shy man who lived alone in the dilapidated 9-bedroom farmhouse his family had once owned. The farm was overgrown, the house was falling apart. Gain lived in one room, the kitchen, which was famously grotesquely filthy. He survived by doing odd jobs around town. He was a handyman, a babysitter. The local men would sometimes hire him, laughing at his strange, giggling, off-kilter personality. They thought he was dim-witted, perhaps slow. The whispers about him were just weird. He was obsessed with anatomy books, lurid pulp novels about cannibals, and the atrocities of the Nazis. But his primary obsession, the town knew, was his mother, Augusta Gein. She had been a religious zealot, a woman who had dominated Ed his entire life, preaching that all other women were vessels of sin. She had died 12 years prior, in 1945. Ed had, in response, sealed off her bedroom, her parlor, her entire world, preserving it perfectly clean,
like a shrine. This is the B-plot. This is the source of the madness. While Ed lived in filth, his mother's tomb was pristine. But to Art Schley and the rest of Plainfield, Ed Gein was just old Ed, a little touched, but harmless. That assumption, that small-town sense of safety, shattered on November 16, 1957. It was the opening weekend of deer season. The town was mostly empty, the men out hunting. Sheriff Schley received a call. Bernice Warden, the 58-year-old owner of the local hardware store, had vanished. Schley drove to the store. The scene was quiet, eerily quiet. He was met by Bernice's son, Frank Warden, who was also a deputy sheriff. Frank was pale. He had opened the store and found it empty. He showed Schley what he had found. The cash register was open. It was empty. A simple robbery, perhaps. But then, on the wooden floor, a dark, wide, sticky trail. A trail of blood. It led from the front counter straight out the back door to the loading dock. This was not a robbery. Frank Warden then showed Schley the store's ledger, the last receipt written that day. It was a simple, handwritten bill for 1 gallon of antifreeze. Frank looked at his boss. He said that old Ed Gein had been in the store the night before, that he had been lollygagging, acting stranger than usual, and that he had mentioned he'd be back the next day, Saturday, to buy a gallon of antifreeze. This is the moment. The click. Art Schley, the normal detective, and Frank Warden, the grieving son, looked at each other. Old Ed, the harmless eccentric, was now the only suspect. The hunt was on. Schley and Warden drove to a local diner. They found Ed Gein there, calmly eating dinner. He was arrested without incident for larceny. But Art Schley knew this was not about stolen money. He had to go to the farm. As the cold, dark Wisconsin night fell, Sheriff Schley, Deputy Warden, and several other officers drove down the long, dark dirt road to the Gein farmhouse. They were, psychologically, prepared to find a missing person. They were prepared to find a suspect in a robbery. They were not prepared for the abyss. They were not prepared for Hoi Hai. They were still normal men from a normal town about to open the door to hell. The drive to the Gein farmhouse was cold, dark, and silent. Sheriff Art Schley, Deputy Frank Warden, the victim's son, and 2 other officers pulled up to the dilapidated 9-bedroom house. It was a dead place. No lights, no sound. The farm was overgrown with weeds, the outbuildings collapsing. It was a pocket of decay, hidden in the heart of normal Plainfield. They were, psychologically, prepared for a robbery suspect, maybe a kidnapping. They were still cops. They exited the car. The air was frigid. They had their flashlights. They approached the side door, the one that led to the kitchen, the only room, according to town gossip, that Ed Gein ever used. It was locked. Schley gave the order. An officer kicked the door in. And the first thing that hit them was not a sight. It was a smell. It was the smell of a tomb. A thick, gag-inducing, complex odor of stale garbage, rotting food, human waste, and something else. Something sweet, metallic, and ancient. Schley, holding his flashlight, was the first to enter. He stepped into the kitchen, and his normal, orderly, small-town mind stopped. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, and what it revealed was not a home. It was a nest. The room was filled, wall to wall, waist high, with garbage. Piles of rotting food, tin cans, greasy rags, pulp magazines, and filth. The floor was invisible. The air was unbreathable. This was not just messy. This was the den of a deeply, profoundly disturbed animal. "Spread out," Schley ordered. his voice muffled by the handkerchief he was now pressing to his face. "Frank, you stay here." He wanted to spare Bernice's son if he could. Schley and another officer, Captain Lloyd Schuferster, pushed past the kitchen garbage deeper into the house. They entered the adjoining summer kitchen, a small, cold, attached woodshed. It was pitch black. Schley raised his heavy, police-issued flashlight. The beam cut through the dark. It landed on an object, hanging from a meat hook on a crossbeam. Schley's normal 1957 small-town brain tried to process the image. It was the middle of deer season. The shape was right. "A deer," he said, perhaps to himself. "He's got a deer." He moved the beam of light up to where the head should be. There was no head. There was only a raw, severed neck and a rope. He moved the beam down. It was not fur. It was pale, white human skin. He moved the beam lower. He saw the unmistakable, gaping, visceral cavity of a human torso. Slit open from the groin to the neck, the organs removed. It was a woman, hung by her ankles and dressed out, exactly like a deer. This is the psychological turning point. This is the abyss. In this single, flashlight-illuminated second, Art Schley's normal world did not just crack, it shattered. He was not looking at a crime scene. He was looking at a butcher shop. He recognized the body. It was the missing shopkeeper. It was his neighbor. It was Bernice Worden. The other officers began to retch. One fled the room, vomiting into the snow outside. Schley, as sheriff, had to hold on. He was the anchor, but the anchor was dragging. The shock was a physical blow. He now knew with sickening certainty that he was not in the home of a robber. He was in the home of a monster. "Search the rest of the house," he ordered, his voice strained. The investigation now became a slow, agonizing descent into the mind of Ed Gain. The officers, moving as if in a nightmare, spread out, their flashlight beams cutting into the other sealed-off rooms. And this is what they found. This is what Art Schley, the normal man, had to see, log, and touch. In the kitchen, he saw it. A simple, cereal-type bowl on a table. He picked it up. He shined his light on it. It was not ceramic. It was the top half of a human skull. He was in a house of trophies. His officers began calling out, their voices cracking. "Sheriff, in here!" He walked into another room. The beam of his flashlight found a lamp on a bedside table. He looked closer. The lampshade was not paper. It was taut, yellowish, translucent. It was made from a human face. They found another. They found a wastebasket, skinned in human flesh. They found a simple thong, a pull cord for a window shade. It was a pair of human lips. They found a belt, studded with human nipples. They found chair seats, reupholstered, with patches of human skin. And then the B-plot, the shrine. Schley found a single door, locked. They forced it. Inside, the room was pristine. It was clean. It was untouched. The bed was neatly made. The air was still. It was the bedroom of Augusta Gein, his mother. This was the source. This was the clean, cold, religious fanatic tomb at the center of the filth. The madness had a source. But the abyss was not done. They found the trophy room. And they found the suit. Hanging in a closet, as if it were a Sunday dress, was Ed Gain's final creation. It was a vest, complete with breasts and leggings. all made from the tanned, leathery skins of middle-aged women. It was a woman's suit. Nearby, in a simple shoebox, they found a collection of 9 salted, preserved vulvas. In a paper bag, they found the head of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had vanished in 1954. And in a pan, on the stove, next to the filth, they found the heart of Bernice Worden. Art Schley, the 43-year-old neighbor from Plainfield, Wisconsin, had seen it all. He had walked step by step into the mind of a madness he could not comprehend. He had seen his neighbor hanging like an animal. He had held bowls made of skulls. He had seen a suit made of his mother's contemporaries. The abyss had not just gazed back, it had infected him. He was, in that moment, no longer a normal man. He was a man who had seen the impossible. And the shock of that night, the psychological trauma of these images, would be a wound that would never, ever heal. The House of Horrors had been catalogued. The sun was rising over Plainfield, illuminating a town that had, overnight, lost its innocence forever. Sheriff Art Schley and his surviving officers stumbled out of that farmhouse, not as cops, but as survivors. They were men in a state of profound psychological shock. They had cataloged the items, but their minds could not process them. The woman suit, the skull bowls, the face lampshades. These were not just evidence, they were profanities. They were violations of the natural order. And Art Schley, the normal man, the neighbor, had been the one to lead the charge. He was the anchor, and the weight of what he had seen had pulled him under. He was, in modern terms, suffering from acute, severe PTSD. But in 1957, there was no name for it. There was no debriefing. There was no counseling. There was just the job. And the next job was the interrogation. Ed Gein had been arrested, calmly, at a local diner. He had been eating. He was, by all accounts, mild-mannered, giggling almost, relieved. He was brought to the Washara County Jail and placed in an interrogation room. And Art Schley, still covered in the smell of that house, his mind still reeling from the image of Bernice Worden hanging from the rafters, walked in. This is the psychological turning point. This is the immediate fracture. This was not a detective entering an interrogation room. This was a traumatized human being confronting the source of his trauma. Schley, our normal man from Act 1, was gone. Gein, the report states, was calm. He was quiet.
He was detached, as if discussing someone else's actions. Schley, on the other hand, was a raw, exposed nerve. He was running on pure, unfiltered adrenaline and horror. The interrogation began. Schley, trying to maintain his professional mask, asked the questions. Gein, in his simple, high-pitched voice, began to answer. And this is when the fracture happened. We do not know the exact words that were spoken, but we know from the legal records that followed what Schley did. In a moment of uncontrollable visceral rage, a rage born not of police brutality, but of profound human shock, Art Schley snapped. The sheriff disappeared, and the man took over. He lunged at Gein. He seized the smaller, milquetoast-like man, and he attacked him. He slammed Gein's head repeatedly into the brick wall of the interrogation room. He was, in that moment, not trying to get a confession. He was trying to punish the abyss. He was trying to hurt the thing that had just shown him the impossible, the thing that had just destroyed his normal world. It was a total, catastrophic breakdown of his professional self. The other officers, stunned, pulled him off. The psychological cost was immediate. Gein, of course, confessed. He confessed to everything. He confessed to killing Bernice Worden. He confessed to killing Mary Hogan.
He confessed to the grave robbing, the suit, the bowls. He talked about it all, calmly. But it didn't matter. Art Schlee's psychological fracture, his human, visceral reaction, had just poisoned the entire case. The confession was thrown out. It was deemed inadmissible, coerced by violence. The man who found the evidence, the man who had suffered the most profound psychological blow, had, in his moment of trauma, become the case's single greatest liability. The abyss had not just gazed back. It had tricked him. It had used his own humanity, his own shock, against him. Schlee had to be removed from the case. He was a witness now, not an investigator. But the damage was done. The fracture was not just legal, it was personal. Art Schlee, the man, had been fundamentally broken by what he saw, and now he had to live with it. Art Schlee's fracture in the interrogation room was the end of his professional involvement in the case, but it was the beginning of his personal, psychological marathon. The legal system took over. Ed Gein, the man who had created the House of Horrors, was, of course, the center of a media circus. But the courts, upon hearing his calm, detached confessions, the stories of his mother, Augusta, our B-plot, the grave robbing, the woman suit, quickly determined he was not sane. In 1958, Ed Gein was found mentally unfit to stand trial. He was a schizophrenic. He was not a criminal, but a madman. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. And for Art Schlee, this was, perhaps, the most terrifying outcome. It was not justice. It was not a resolution. The monster wasn't slain. He was postponed. The man who had created the House of Horrors was now simply ill. But Schlee had to go back to being normal. He had to go back to being the sheriff of Plainfield. He had to go back to solving tractor thefts and bar fights, all while carrying the memory of Act 2. This is the psychological cost. For the next 11 years, Art Schlee was a haunted man. He was, as those close to him would say, never the same. He had seen the proof that the normal world of Plainfield was a thin, fragile veneer, and that underneath it, an impossible, unimaginable madness could fester. He had seen the skull bowls. He had seen the face lampshades. He had seen his neighbor, Bernice Worden, dressed like a deer. These images were not memories. They were shrapnel. They were embedded in his mind. He was tormented. He reportedly suffered from debilitating insomnia. He became withdrawn. The neighbor, the normal man from Act 1, was gone, replaced by a man who had seen the abyss. He was a ghost, haunting his own life, waiting. And then, in 1968, the postponement ended. The psychological turning point, the final one, the one that would kill him, arrived. Doctors at the Central State Hospital, after a decade of treatment, made a stunning announcement. Ed Gein was now, in their medical opinion, mentally competent. He was sane enough to understand the charges against him. He was, therefore, fit to stand trial. A new trial was set for November 1968. And this, for Art Schlee, was a death sentence. A trial meant witnesses. And the only living witness who had been first into that house, the only witness who had seen the entirety of the abyss, the only witness who had found Bernice Worden's body, was Art Schlee. He was called to testify. We must understand what this meant psychologically. This was not just giving a report. This was not reading his notes. He was being asked by the court to go back, to stand in front of a jury, a crowd, and the world, and to verbally relive Act 2. He would be forced to describe in meticulous, agonizing detail every single object he had touched. He would have to describe the smell. He would have to describe the feel of the skull bowl.
He would have to describe the sight of the lampshade made from a human face. He would have to, once again, stand in that dark woodshed in his mind and describe the moment his flashlight beam found the hanging, eviscerated body of his neighbor, Bernice Worden. He was being asked to open the box in his mind that he had spent the last 11 years desperately, agonizingly trying to keep shut. The stress was unbearable. The dread of the coming testimony, the anticipation of reliving that night, was a psychological torture chamber. He was 43 years old. He was, physically, a strong man. But the psychological cost, the marathon, had taken its toll.
On March 22, 1968, just 7 months before he was scheduled to take the stand, Art Schley, the man who had looked into the abyss, died. The official cause was heart failure. But everyone in Plainfield, everyone who knew him, including the judge who would later preside over Gaines' trial, knew the real cause. As Judge Robert Golmar would later write, Schley was a victim of Ed Gain, as surely as if he had been shot in the head. The abyss had won. The madness of Augusta Gain, our B-plot, which had created the monster, Ed Gain, had become a contagion. It had reached out of that dark, filthy farmhouse, and it had infected the normal man who found it.
Art Schley did not gaze into the abyss. He fell into it. And 11 years later, it finally, fatally, pulled him under. Tonight, we continue our series on the detective's point of view. This is a story about a 7-day psychological pressure cooker. In 1978, Lieutenant Joe Kozenchak, a brand new detective commander, was handed a simple missing person case, a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest. The trail led, almost immediately, to a pillar of the community, John Wayne Gacy, a successful, politically connected contractor. For 7 days, Kozenchak had to conduct a 24/7 surveillance on a man he knew was the killer, but couldn't arrest. This is the story of that 7-day war of nerves, a cat-and-mouse game, against an arrogant narcissist, all while the detective knew that the boy he was looking for was likely just on the other side of the wall. In the world of police work, there are 2 kinds of pressure. There's the hot pressure of a chase, the adrenaline, the sirens. And then there's the cold pressure. The cold pressure is a psychological vice. It's the pressure of knowing but not being able to prove. It's the pressure of a ticking clock, where every second you wait, the trail gets colder or another life is at risk. It's the pressure of stillness, of waiting, of surveillance. For Lieutenant Joe Kozenchak, that cold pressure began on December 11, 1978. He was, by his own admission, a neophyte. He had only been the chief of detectives for the Des Plaines, Illinois Police Department for 6 months. He was still finding his footing, still feeling the weight of the new command. And he was, at his core, a father. This is a critical psychological seed. His own son was a high school student, just like the boy whose face was about to land on his desk. The case began, as they so often do, with a mundane, frantic call: a missing child. The boy was Robert Piest, 15 years old. He was a good kid, a reliable employee at the local Nissen pharmacy. On the evening of December 11th, he was working his shift. His mother, Elizabeth, was there, waiting to pick him up. At 9 p.m., Robert walked over to his mother, who was sitting at the pharmacy counter. He was excited. He told her he had just been offered a great summer job by a local contractor, a man who was doing some remodeling work at the store. The job paid $8 an hour, an incredible wage for a 15-year-old in 1978. The contractor, a friendly, heavy-set man, was there. He told Robert and his mother that they just needed to go over a few things at his house, not far from the pharmacy. Robert Piest, excited, told his mom he'd be back in just a few minutes. He walked out of the pharmacy and into the dark. Elizabeth Piest waited. 9:15 p.m., 9:30 p.m., 10 p.m. The frantic, rising panic of a parent. She called the police. When the case file landed on Joe Kozenchak's desk, it was, at first, a standard missing person case. A teenage boy, maybe he ran off. But this one was different. There was a witness, the mother, and there was a name. The contractor, the friendly, heavy-set man. His name was John Wayne Gacy. Kozenchak's detectives did a preliminary check, and the file that came back was confusing. The man was not a criminal. He was a pillar. John Wayne Gacy was, by all accounts, Mr. Desplaines. He was the owner of a successful, flourishing construction business, PDM Contractors. He was a precinct captain for the local Democratic Party. He had photos of himself shaking hands with the First Lady, Rosalind Carter. He was, famously, Pogo the Clown, a man who volunteered countless hours at children's hospitals, who threw massive block party-style barbecues for the entire neighborhood. He had recently been named Man of the Year by the local Jaycees. He was, in short, untouchable. But the psychological stake for Kozenchak was already set. He was a new commander. This was a high-profile case, and the missing boy, Robert Piest, went to the same high school as his own son. This was not a file. This was personal. On the night of December 12th, roughly 24 hours after Piest vanished, Kozenchak, working late, decided to make the call himself. He dialed the number for PDM Contractors. Gacy answered. And in this first, brief, chilling phone call, the 7-day psychological war began. This is the B-plot. This is Gacy's arrogance. Kozenchak was polite, professional. Mr. Kozenchak, I'm Lieutenant Kozenchak. We're investigating the disappearance of a local boy, Robert Piest. We were told you were the last person seen with him. Gacy's response was not normal. A normal person, a pillar of the community, would be horrified. Oh my God, is he okay? What can I do to help? Gacy was annoyed. He was arrogant. I talked to lots of kids about jobs, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I don't remember that name. Piest? No, never talked to him. He was immediately lying. Kozenchak, the neophyte detective, felt the first cold spike of dread. He knew Gacy was lying. The victim's mother had seen them talking. Kozenchak pressed, politely. Well, Mr. Gacy, we'd still like to talk to you, just to clear this up. And Gacy, the narcissist, began the cat-and-mouse game. You still want to talk to me? Gacy said, as if inconvenienced. Fine, I'm busy. I'll be at your office. How about 1 a.m.? Kozenchak, stunned, agreed. 1 a.m. He sat in his office. He waited. 1 a.m. came and went. No Gacy. 1:30 a.m. No Gacy. 2 a.m. Joe Kozenchak, the new commander, sat alone in his office, and he understood. He was being played. He was being manipulated, disrespected, and taunted by the Man of the Year. Gacy was not acting like an innocent witness. He was acting like a predator, asserting his dominance. The psychological war had begun. Kozenchak now knew he was not dealing with a concerned citizen. He was dealing with a liar, and he was dealing with a man who believed pathologically that he was untouchable. The cat-and-mouse game had begun. John Wayne Gacy had missed his 1 a.m. appointment. He was asserting his dominance, treating the police as an annoyance. But Joe Kozenchak was not just a neophyte. He was a cop, and he was angry. He didn't just wait. He immediately put Gacy's house, 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, under surveillance. A ghost car sat in the dark, watching. At 3:20 a.m. on the morning of December 13th,
The untouchable citizen finally decided to grace the police with his presence. John Wayne Gacy waddled into the Des Plaines police station. And he was not apologetic. He was arrogant. This is our B-plot in the flesh. He was complaining, blustering.
He complained about the officers watching his house. He threatened to call his connections in the Democratic Party. He was the victim. Kozenchak, though furious, was a detective. He was observing. And he noticed something. Gacy's shoes and the cuffs of his pants were caked in fresh, wet mud. Kozenchak's mind raced. It was 3:20 a.m. It was the middle of December. Where had this man been? Gacy, the narcissist, had made his first critical physical mistake. Kozenchak now had two things. One, Gacy was the last man seen with Piest, probable cause. And two, Gacy was, at that very moment, covered in mud, suggesting he had just come from burying something. Kozenchak had enough. He got a judge out of bed. At dawn on December 13th, less than 48 hours after Piest vanished, Joe Kozenchak and his team of detectives stood at the front door of 8213 West Summerdale. They had their first search warrant. This is the psychological turning point. This is the moment Kozenchak and the world stepped into the dual-life monster's den. They opened the door. The house was immaculate. It was a normal, suburban, ranch-style home. It was clean. It smelled faintly of something. A strange, chemical, musty smell. Gacy, the arrogant host, our B-plot, was cooperating. He was walking them around, almost as if giving a tour. He was pointing things out, his man-of-the-year mask firmly in place. Kozenchak's detectives, desperate, began tearing the place apart. They were looking for Robert Piest. They were looking for a body, a struggle, blood. And this is the core of the psychological cost. This is the frustration. They found nothing. No Robert Piest, no bloodstains, no sign of a struggle. The house was, legally, clean. The team was deflating. The warrant was turning up empty. But Kozenchak, the detective, was not just looking for a body. He was looking for a mind. And that he found. As the detectives opened drawers, as they looked in closets, they were not finding legal evidence. They were finding psychological evidence. They found a collection of things that did not match the man-of-the-year facade. In a drawer, they found a set of police-style handcuffs. In another, a small nickel-plated revolver. On a shelf, they found books, medical journals, books on pederasty. They found syringes. They found a collection of driver's licenses belonging to other young men. Kozenchak's cold pressure was rising. This was not the home of a pillar of the community. This was the home of a predator. And then one detective, searching the kitchen trash can, found the receipt. It was a small, flimsy piece of paper, a photo developing receipt from the Nissen Pharmacy, the exact place where Robert Piest had worked. The receipt was dated after Piest had disappeared. This was it. This was the link. Kozenchak now knew, with 100% bone-chilling certainty, his man was Gacy. He knew Gacy was a sexual deviant. He knew Gacy was a liar, the receipt. He knew Gacy had been out, in the mud, burying something. He knew Robert Piest was dead, and that Gacy was the killer. He looked at the immaculate house. He looked at the clean carpets. He looked at that strange, musty smell. And he knew, instinctively, that the body was here. It was in the house, under the floors, in the walls. But he couldn't prove it. The search warrant was for the house. It did not give him the authority to rip up the floorboards or to drill into the foundation. He had no legal proof of a homicide. He only had psychological proof. And this is the single most agonizing psychological cost of Act 2. Joe Kuzenchak, the detective who knew, had to leave. He had to thank Mr. Gacy for his cooperation. He had to pull his team out. And he had to walk past John Wayne Gacy, the man of the year. The man who knew he had just won the first round. The man who was, almost certainly, smiling. Kuzenchak was, in that moment, completely, totally powerless. He had been inside the monster's lair, and he had to let the monster go. Joe Kuzenchak stood on the curb outside 8213 West Summerdale and watched John Wayne Gacy close the front door. The man of the year was safe in his home. Kuzenchak was now trapped in a psychological hell. He had just been inside the monster's lair. He had seen the psychological evidence, the cuffs, the licenses, the Nissan receipt. He knew, with the unshakable, gut-deep certainty of a seasoned cop, that Gacy was the killer. He knew Robert Piest was, or had been, in that house. And he had been powerless to do anything about it. The warrant was useless. The evidence was purely circumstantial. He had no body. He had no proof. He had only suspicion. This is where the cold pressure, the psychological vice, begins. Kuzenchak made the only call he could. Lock it down, he ordered. And so the 7-day pressure cooker began. He established a 24/7, round-the-clock surveillance on John Wayne Gacy. This was not a stakeout as you see in the movies. This was a war of attrition, a war of nerves, fought in the brutal, freezing cold of a Chicago December. Kuzenchak and his small team of detectives, men like Walter Albrecht and Larry Hotchmeister, began to live in their unmarked cars, parked just down the street from Gacy's home. This is the psychological cost. They lived on adrenaline, stale donuts, and bitter, cold coffee. They worked 18, 20-hour shifts. They didn't go home. They slept, fitfully, in the cramped front seats of their cars, the heaters blasting, their eyes never, ever leaving that house. And they were subjected to the 3 crushing psychological pressures that define this case. Pressure point 1, the personal stake. Kuzenchak was not just hunting a killer. He was hunting a killer who knew him. Gacy knew his name. He knew where he worked. And Gacy was, Kuzenchak believed, already escalating.
The gánh nặng cá nhân, personal stake, receded in Act 1. The fact that Kuzenchak's own son went to school with Robert Piest was now a constant, terrifying presence. Kuzenchak was not just a detective. He was a father, hunting a man who killed sons. He called his wife. He told her to lock the doors, to watch the kids. He was terrified that this monster, who he had just cornered and failed to catch, would retaliate against his family. Pressure point 2, the political untouchable. Gacy was not a common criminal. He was the pillar of the community, our Act 1 seed. He was politically connected. And Gacy, the narcissist, used this. He attacked.
This is our B-plot, Gacy's arrogance. While Kuzenchak's men were freezing, Gacy was warm, and he was busy. He was on the phone constantly to his high-powered lawyers. He was on the phone to Kuzenchak's superiors, demanding that the surveillance be stopped. He was filing official complaints, claiming police harassment. Kuzenchak wasn't just fighting Gacy. He was fighting his own command. He was the neophyte commander, and he was risking his entire career, his reputation, his job, on a hunch. If he was wrong, he was finished. Pressure point 3, the psychological taunting. This was the worst part. Gacy knew they were out there, and he loved it. He was a malignant narcissist, and the surveillance was not a threat. It was attention. It was narcissistic supply. He was performing for them. The taunting was relentless. He would call Kozenchak's office, complaining about the harassment, and then he would thank Kozenchak for the police protection. He would leave his house, get in his car, and as he drove past the unmarked surveillance vehicle, he would wave, a friendly little hello boys wave. He would flash his headlights at them. He was playing. And then the ultimate psychological taunt. One night, in the sub-zero cold, Gacy walked out of his house. He walked down the driveway, across the street, to the car where two freezing, exhausted detectives were sitting. He knocked on the window. The detectives, stunned, rolled it down. Gacy smiled. The man of the year. "Gee, fellas," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "It's awful cold out here. Why don't you come inside? I'll make you some coffee." He was inviting them inside. It was a power move of such profound, narcissistic arrogance, it was almost unbelievable. He was inviting them into the very tomb they were guarding, knowing they were powerless to accept. He was flexing his invincibility. Kozenchak, living in this 24/7 pressure cooker, was at a breaking point. While the surveillance team was being psychologically tortured, the rest of the detectives were in a frantic race, trying to build the case away from the house. They were reinvestigating Gacy's past. They found the 1972 sodomy arrest. They found the Pogo the Clown connection. They found other survivors, like Jeffrey Rignall, who had been abducted, tortured, and left for dead by Gacy. Kozenchak was no longer looking for one victim. He was realizing, with dawning, sick horror, that he was hunting America's first serial killer. The pressure was mounting. The smell from the house, that musty, chemical smell, was getting worse. Kozenchak knew the bodies were in there. He knew Gacy was a monster. He knew he was running out of time. But he still had no proof. The 7-day pressure cooker was at its breaking point. Lieutenant Joe Kozenchak was out of time. His superiors were breathing down his neck. The political, untouchable John Wayne Gacy was winning the psychological war. Kozenchak knew the bodies were in that house. The musty, cloying smell of decay was getting stronger, a fact his surveillance teams noted daily. But he still had no legal proof of a murder. He was trapped. If he pulled the surveillance, Gacy would know he had won, and he might flee. If he kept the surveillance, he might lose his job. He needed a mistake. He needed the narcissist, our B-plot, to get sloppy. And on day 7, Gacy got sloppy. This is the psychological turning point. This is the hubris payoff. Gacy, the man of the year, the man who believed he was invincible, was so arrogant, so contemptuous of the police he was playing with, that he did something incredibly, monumentally stupid. While under 24/7 police surveillance, he sold marijuana to a young man, an employee at a local gas station. The surveillance team, watching this minor, unrelated crime, immediately radioed it in. And for Joe Kozenchak, this was the sound of the universe handing him a crowbar. This was the break. He didn't have a warrant for murder, but now he had a warrant for delivery of a controlled substance. It was a small, petty, almost laughable charge, but it was enough. This was Kozenchak's brilliant tactical move. He wasn't going to arrest Gacy for being a monster. He was going to arrest Gacy for being a drug dealer. It was the excuse he needed to get Gacy out of that house. On December 21st, 1978, the 7-day war ended. Kozenchak's team, armed with the drug warrant, arrested John Wayne Gacy. The man of the year, the untouchable political player, was finally in a cell. The cat was caged. And the mice could finally search the house. Kozenchak, now with time and probable cause, got his second search warrant. This one was not a polite visit. This was a warrant to dismantle. He and his exhausted, freezing, sleep-deprived team re-entered 8213 West Summerdale. This time, there were no games. There was no Mr. Gacy giving a tour. They followed the smell, the musty, sweet, chemical smell of death. It led them to a closet. Inside, a small, square trapdoor led to the crawl space beneath the house. A young detective, his heart pounding, aimed his flashlight into the dark, earthen void. The abyss finally, literally, opened. It was not a grave, it was a dump, a mass grave. The crawl space was packed, shoulder to shoulder, with the decomposing, lime-covered remains of young men. 26 bodies. They found Robert Piest. He was, as Kozenchak had feared, in the crawl space. And this is the final, devastating, psychological turning point. This is the USP. This is the cost for Joe Kozenchak. As the bodies were being recovered, as the horror was being cataloged, Kozenchak was hit by a sickening, profound realization. He did the math. He looked at the timeline. Robert Piest had been killed immediately after Gacy brought him home, on December 11th, which meant when Kozenchak had entered this house on December 13th, Act 2, when he had stood in this very room, when he had talked to Gacy, smelling the strange smell, when Gacy, the narcissist, had played with him, Robert Piest, the 15-year-old boy his own son knew, was already dead. He was in the crawl space. He was right above Kozenchak's head. This is the psychological cost that defines this case for the detective. It is one thing to find a body. It is another thing entirely to realize you were in the room with the killer, helpless, breathing the same air as the victim, separated only by a few feet of floorboards. It is the proximity combined with the powerlessness. Kozenchak had won. He had caught the monster. He had stopped the killing. But the 7-day pressure cooker had left an indelible psychological scar. He, a father, had been so close to saving the boy, but he had been 7 days too late. He had played a 7-day psychological war against a monster, only to find out the battle had already been lost before it even began. Our final case from the detective's file is about a psychological lie. When the .44 caliber killer began taunting New York, he gave the police a story. He called himself Son of Sam. He said he was obeying the commands of a demon, speaking through a neighbor's dog. And for a year, the NYPD believed him. They hunted for a paranoid schizophrenic, a satanic cult. But they were being played. This is the story of the psychological turning point inside the investigation, when a small group of detectives realized the demons were a distraction, and that the killer wasn't insane. He was just a narcissistic loser. In detective work, the hunter's greatest liability is assumption. We are trained to find patterns, to build profiles. But when the killer knows you are doing this, he can feed you a false pattern. He can build a false profile. He can hand you the map to a maze he built just for you. And for 1 year, the New York City Police Department, the largest, most sophisticated force in the world, was lost in just such a maze built by a 24-year-old postal worker. Our story begins not with the killer, but with the city. New York City, 1976. It was not the city you see today.
It was a city on the verge of total systemic collapse. It was a psychological pressure cooker. The city was bankrupt. A financial crisis had hollowed it out. Garbage was piling up in the streets. The subways were covered in graffiti, monuments to decay. Crime was not just high, it was a state of nature. And then the heat came. A blistering, oppressive 100-degree summer heat wave that felt like it would never end. This was the abyss, a city that felt angry, hopeless, and out of control. And into this abyss, a new phantom emerged. July 29, 1976, the Bronx. Donna Loria, 18, and Jody Valenti, 19, were sitting in a parked car, just talking, as teenagers do. A man walked up, pulled a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver from a paper bag, and fired. Donna was killed instantly. Jody was wounded. The detectives on the scene, from the 8th Homicide District, were baffled. It was senseless. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a drug deal. It was just chaos. The case was a whodunit with no why. October 23, 1976, Queens. Carl DiLiberto and Rosemary Keenan were sitting in a parked car. A man walked up and fired, wounding Carr. The MO was the same. The bullet was the same, a .44 caliber. November 27, 1976, Queens. Donna DeMasi, 16, and Joanne Lomino, 18, were walking home. A man stepped out, asked for directions, and then fired. Both were hit. Joanne died. The pressure cooker was now boiling. The media sensed a pattern. They dubbed him the .44 caliber killer. The NYPD, sensing a crisis, began to spin up what would become the largest task force in its history, Operation Omega. This was a massive 300-officer dragnet pulling in the best detectives from every borough. The men chosen to lead this hunt were Deputy Inspector Timothy Dowd, the boss and the public face, the man who would become the killer's rival, Captain Joe Borelli. Borelli and Dowd were classic, old-school, shoe-leather cops. They were men of facts. They were men of evidence. And in early 1977, they had nothing. The killer was a ghost. He struck, he vanished. The bullets matched, but the descriptions were chaos. This is the first failed psychological pivot. A detective's mind, a profiler's mind, needs consistency. But the survivors, they were all telling different stories. The witnesses from the Loria Valenti shooting, they hadn't seen him clearly. Carl DiLiberto, the October victim, he described a tall man, dark hair, maybe 20s. Donna DeMasi, the November victim, she described a man with blonde hair. The detectives were stumped. How could the killer have dark hair and blonde hair? The psychological assumption they landed on was, at the time, logical. They weren't hunting one man. They were hunting a team, a gang. This was the first failure. The profilers, the detectives, the entire 300-man task force were now, psychologically, looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for a conspiracy. They were looking for a group of men working together. Maybe the mafia. Maybe a new Manson family. And while they were lost in this gang theory, the lone killer struck again. January 30th, 1977, Queens. Christine Fround and John Deal. Parked car. The .44 spoke. Christine died. March 8th, 1977, Queens. Virginia Voskerichian, 19, a college student walking home, shot in the face, killed. The city was now in a full-blown, media-fueled panic. Women were cutting their long, dark hair. They were buying blonde wigs. The abyss of New York City now had a face, or rather, two faces, and the police were chasing them both in the wrong direction. The killer was winning. The NYPD, and specifically Operation Omega, was lost. They were chasing ghosts. Their psychological assumption that they were hunting a gang was based on the contradictory eyewitness sketches. They were running in circles, wasting precious time, while the .44 caliber killer was watching and learning. And then, after the murder of Virginia Voskerichian in March 1977, the killer decided to escalate. The physical attacks were no longer enough. The low-class narcissist inside him, the invisible man who had been ignored his entire life, now craved recognition. He decided to stop being a phantom and to become a performer. This is our B-plot. This is the psychological war. On March 10, 1977, a letter arrived at the 8th Homicide District. It was addressed personally to the public face of the investigation, Captain Joe Borelli. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The killer had just chosen his rival. He had turned a citywide manhunt into a personal duel. Borelli, the old-school detective, now found himself a character in the killer's narcissistic drama. The letter itself was a bombshell. It was rambling, arrogant, and terrifying. It began, "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a woman-hater." He was reading the newspapers. He was listening to Borelli's press conferences. He was offended. And then he gave himself a name. He wrote, "I am the son of Sam. I am a monster. Sam, my father, sends me commands. Go out and kill," commands Papa Sam. He had branded himself. The psychological game was set. The police were no longer just hunting a .44 caliber bullet. They were hunting Son of Sam. But the killer was not done. He was enjoying the spotlight. He had seen the chaos he had created. He had seen the fear in the media. And he, the invisible man, finally felt powerful. So on June 1st, 1977, he escalated his performance again. He sent another letter. This time, he bypassed the police. He sent it directly to the media, to the most famous voice in the city, Jimmy Breslin, the legendary columnist for the Daily News. This was the psychological lie. This was the maze. This letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed, intentionally or not, to send the entire NYPD profiling team down the wrong rabbit hole. It was filled with the exact kind of bizarre, terrifying, cinematic details that the 1970s public, primed by movies like The Exorcist, was ready to believe. He wrote about Father Sam, who was drunk as a skunk. He wrote about the demons and Wheaties and the goats. He wrote, "I am the Beelzebub, the chubby behemoth." And, most critically, he wrote that Sam, his father, was a neighbor who was, in fact, a dog, a black Labrador retriever who was possessed. We must pause and analyze this from the detective's point of view. Captain Borelli, Inspector Dowd, and the 300 detectives of Operation Omega were drowning in this. They were shoe leather cops. They were men of facts. And they were now being handed a narrative that was pure psychological chaos. They were facing the second failed psychological pivot. The first pivot, the gang theory from Act 1, was based on contradictory physical evidence, the sketches. This second pivot was based on the killer's own words, and they believed him. The NYPD, in its infancy of criminal profiling, took this letter literally. This was a catastrophic psychological mistake. The internal memos, the think tank sessions, the entire direction of the 300-man task force shifted. They were no longer looking for a gang. They were now looking for a paranoid schizophrenic, a true madman, a lunatic who genuinely heard voices from a dog. Or, even worse, they were looking for a satanic cult. This theory, the 44 caliber cult, took hold. It explained everything to them. It explained the contradictory sketches. It was a cult with different members. It explained the satanic language, Beelzebub, demons. It explained the dogs. Cults were known for animal sacrifice. The detectives were no longer hunting a person. They were hunting a conspiracy. They were hunting demons. This was the abyss, and the detectives, led by the B-plot, the killer's own lies, had fallen right into it. The psychological cost was immense. Thousands of man-hours were now wasted. Detectives were assigned to investigating dogs. They were sent to the prairies of North Dakota to investigate satanic symbols. They were chasing every witchcraft rumor in the 5 boroughs. And all the while, the real killer, the lone, non-insane, invisible man, was sitting in his small Yonkers apartment, probably laughing. He was not a demon. He was not a Satanist. He was just a narcissistic loser. And he had successfully, psychologically, outsmarted the entire 300-man NYPD task force. He had handed them a false profile, and they had taken the bait. The city was in a panic. Women were dyeing their hair blonde. And the police. The police were chasing dogs. The cold pressure on Borelli and Dowd was now unbearable. They were losing. Operation Omega was lost in the desert. They were psychologically pinned down by the B-plot, the killer's own masterful psychological lie. The 300-man task force was now operating on the satanic cult theory. They were chasing demons, Beelzebub, and possessed dogs. Detectives were assigned to investigate and even shoot black Labradors in the Yonkers area, hoping to find a clue. They were, in short, losing. The killer was still out there. The city was in a panic, and the NYPD was chasing dogs. This is the psychological cost of believing a pathological liar. The detectives, Borelli, Dowd, and their team, were being humiliated by the very man they were hunting. He had turned them into characters in his own sick, narcissistic play. And then, in the summer of 1977, as the Summer of Sam reached its fever pitch, a small group of detectives within Operation Omega had the real psychological turning point. They realized they were being played. This was the shift. They made a conscious, critical decision to stop listening to the why of the letters and to start cold-heartedly analyzing the how of the crimes. They decided to ignore the B-plot, the lies, and focus only on the A-plot, the facts. They threw out the satanic cult profile. It was noise. It was a distraction. And they built a new psychological profile, a profile based not on the killer's words, but on his actions. This is the loner/loser pivot, and it is the 5-5 USP of this detective story. This new behavioral profile was a masterpiece of deductive reasoning. 1. He is not insane. He is organized. The detectives realized that a paranoid schizophrenic, as the letter suggested, is chaotic. He kills randomly. The .44 caliber killer was not chaotic. He was methodical. He stalked his victims. He chose his locations, lovers' lanes. He chose his victim type, long dark hair. He had a consistent MO, the .44 bulldog. He knew how to escape. This was not madness. This was planning. 2. He is not a cult. He is a loner.
The gang theory from Act 1 was now dead. The cult theory from Act 2 was also dead. Why? Because the crimes were lonely. They were the acts of a single, sexually frustrated, inadequate man lashing out. The letters, the detectives now realized, were not the ramblings of a cult. They were the fantasy of a man who wished he was part of something bigger, something demonic and powerful. 3. He is not a demon.
He is a narcissistic loser. This was the final, brilliant leap. Why write the letters? Why taunt Borelli? Why brag to Jimmy Breslin? Because he was a nobody. He was a classic loser profile, a man who was powerless, invisible, and sexually inadequate in his real day-to-day life. He was the man no one looked at, the man who couldn't get a date. The gun and the letters were his power. The murders made him feel big, and the letters made him famous. He was not a Satanist. He was just a narcissist, desperate for the attention he could not get anywhere else. This new profile, organized, loner, narcissistic loser, completely changed the investigation. Operation Omega was rebooted psychologically. They stopped chasing satanic cults. They stopped investigating dogs. And they started a new hunt, a hunt for an invisible man. They started running background checks on the losers, the weirdos, the nobodies. They started looking at the men who, in 1977 New York, were everywhere but were never seen. The security guards, the taxi drivers, the mailmen. The detectives had finally stopped listening to the killer's lie and had started to think like him. They were no longer in his psychological maze. They were, at last, building their own, and they were about to find their Holy Grail. The loner loser profile was complete. Operation Omega, the 300-man task force, had finally stopped listening to the satanic B-plot, the killer's lies, and was now, at last, hunting the right man. They were no longer looking for a demon. They were looking for an invisible, narcissistic loser. They were primed. They were ready. They just needed one final piece. And on July 31st, 1977, the killer gave it to them. It was a hot, humid night. Stacy Moskowitz, 20, and Robert Violante, 20, were sitting in a parked car in a lover's lane in Brooklyn. Son of Sam approached. He fired his .44 Bulldog. Stacy Moskowitz was killed. Robert Violante was blinded in one eye. It was another tragic, brutal, senseless attack. It was, as the detectives knew, his M.O. But this time, there was a witness. A woman named Cecilia Davis, who lived nearby, had been walking her dog. She had seen it. She had seen the man. She had seen him get into his car, a yellow, compact car. And, critically, she had seen him being ticketed by a patrol officer just minutes before the shooting. This was the clue. But we must analyze this clue from the detective's point of view. On its surface, a parking ticket is nothing. It's the most mundane, useless, bureaucratic piece of paper in a homicide investigation. If Operation Omega had still been operating on the satanic cult theory, Act 2, that parking ticket would have been trash. Why? Because a satanic cult, a gang, a conspiracy, does not get a parking ticket. They are too organized. They are too evil. They don't park illegally next to their own crime scene. The clue would have been ignored. But this is the 5.5 USP. This is the payoff. Operation Omega was not on the satanic cult profile anymore. They were, as of Act 3, operating on the new psychological pivot, the organized loner loser profile.
And when you look at the parking ticket through that psychological lens, it is not trash. It is the Holy Grail. The detectives, led by Dowd, had the aha moment. Why? Because a loner, loser, a nobody, an invisible man is exactly the kind of person who would be arrogant enough to park illegally near his hunting ground, stupid enough to not notice or care about a parking ticket, and, most importantly, invisible enough that the patrol cop who wrote the ticket looked right at him and saw nothing. The patrol cop saw a nobody in a yellow car. He did not see a monster. The new profile had just turned the most useless clue into the only clue that mattered. The cold pressure was now hot. The detectives didn't just look at the ticket, they launched an all-out blitz. They ran a massive city-wide search for every single parking summons issued in that area on that night. The search was grueling, thousands of tickets. And then they found it. A yellow Ford Galaxy, ticketed for being parked next to a fire hydrant. The registration? David Berkowitz. The address? Apartment 7E, 35 Pine Street, Yonkers. The occupation? U.S. Postal Service. The loner/loser profile had clicked into place. He wasn't a demon. He was a mailman. The NYPD descended on 35 Pine Street. They ran his name. They discovered he himself had been a peeper, a fire starter, arsonist. He was a known weird loner. They looked at his car, the yellow Ford Galaxy, and in the back seat, in plain view, they saw the butt of a rifle. They had him. On August 10, 1977, the psychological marathon ended. As David Berkowitz walked out of his apartment building, a detective approached his car. He looked at Berkowitz, the invisible mailman, and he said, "I'm Detective D.I. Filatico. Do you know who I am?" And Berkowitz, the Beelzebub, the chubby behemoth, the satanic mastermind, just smiled. The lie was over. The B-plot was gone.
Yeah, Berkowitz said, with a calm, narcissistic relief. I'm Son of Sam. He had been found. The invisible man was finally seen. He looked at the detective, and in a perfect summary of the entire 13-month psychological war, he said, "Well, you got me."